The Ardennes in December 1944 was a region of dense forests, narrow roads, steep ridges, and unpredictable winter weather. For the U.S. Army, this sector was considered relatively quiet. It was a place where exhausted divisions rotated in for rest, refit, and recovery. Defensive positions existed, but they were thinly manned, stretched over long frontages, and backed by limited reserves. American commanders expected local German probes, not a major offensive. This assumption created the exact conditions the German high command sought. Hitler believed that the Western Allies, confident after liberating France, were vulnerable to a sudden, concentrated blow. The Ardennes, lightly held and logistically strained, became the chosen corridor for a last attempt to reverse the war's trajectory. The German plan aimed to split the Allied front, isolate British forces in the north, and seize Antwerp. If successful, the shock could fracture Allied cooperation and force political negotiations. To achieve this, the Germans concentrated several armored and infantry divisions under strict secrecy. They avoided radio communications, moved at night, and relied on poor weather to neutralize Allied air superiority. The attack depended on speed. German armored columns had to break through the American lines, capture key crossroads, and advance deep before U.S. forces understood the scale of the operation. Fuel shortages were anticipated, but planners believed captured American depots would sustain the advance. Every part of the plan relied on surprise and rapid momentum. Before dawn, on 16 December, the offensive began under heavy fog. The opening artillery barrage struck across a broad front, targeting communications centers, headquarters, and road hubs. American forces, caught off guard, initially believed the shelling signaled a limited action, but as infantry assaults unfolded and armored spearheads advanced through the wooded terrain, the magnitude of the attack became evident. In many sectors, American companies were isolated, lacking clear information about events occurring just a few miles away. Communications lines were cut, roads became congested with retreating units and civilians, and command posts struggled to assemble coherent defensive plans. The sudden pressure created disorder, yet disorder did not equal collapse. Small American units held crossroads, bridges, and ridge lines longer than the Germans expected, forcing delays that chipped away at the offensive's timetable. These early delays mattered. German armored units advancing through the forest relied on precise timing. Without rapid progress, fuel shortages would cripple mobility. The U.S. Army's scattered but determined resistance began to impose exactly this kind of friction. In several towns, platoons and companies held out against superior numbers, buying hours that accumulated into critical days. Roadblocks manned by engineers, military police, and ad hoc groups of retreating soldiers slowed columns that needed uninterrupted movement. Even when pushed back, American defenders often destroyed bridges or obstructed routes, forcing German armor to seek alternate paths. The terrain magnified the impact of each delay. As the first day ended, American commanders realized the attack was no localized probe, but a major strategic offensive. Corps and division headquarters mobilized available reserves, redirected artillery, and attempted to form coherent defensive lines. The U.S. Army's decentralized command, structure designed to function even under disrupted communications, allowed junior officers to take initiative. In many villages and ridges, decisions made by lieutenants and captains shaped the early battlefield. These officers did not know the broader plan, but they recognized the importance of holding ground long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Their actions began to slow the German advance at points the German high command considered essential for maintaining momentum. On the northern shoulder of the attack, American units quickly recognized the importance of Elsenborn Ridge. This high ground provided observation over key roadways and offered terrain suitable for concentrated artillery defense. U.S. infantry divisions, supported by well-positioned artillery, turned the ridge into a barrier the Germans could not bypass without heavy losses. The German plan expected breakthroughs here, yet every assault met accurate, sustained fire. The fighting at Elsenborn Ridge illustrated how American artillery, using forward observers, rapid-fire missions, and coordinated barrages, compensated for being outnumbered on the ground. German armored units attempting to move east of the ridge encountered devastating artillery fire, losing time and vehicles. In the center of the attack, the situation was more chaotic. Several American units were overrun or forced into rapid withdrawal. The lack of clear defensive lines allowed German armored spearheads to penetrate deep toward St. Vith and Bastogne. But even in retreat, American forces imposed delays through fighting withdrawals, road demolitions, and improvised defenses. Every hour lost eroded the operational plan that required uninterrupted momentum toward the Meuse River. German logistics officers increasingly struggled to allocate fuel. Vehicles were abandoned, supply trucks lagged behind, and armored units were forced to consolidate resources. The rapid, decisive advance, envisioned by planners, was already faltering. In the southern sector, American divisions, stretched across wide frontages, began organizing fallback positions to contain the expanding German Bulge. The shifting situation required immediate decision-making at all levels. Some units were ordered to hold ground at all costs, while others repositioned to create a flexible defense. The vast road network behind the American lines allowed commanders to move reinforcements more efficiently than their German counterparts, who relied on congested forest roads vulnerable to air attack once the weather cleared. By the end of the offensive's opening phase, German progress was visible but insufficient. The Allies had been surprised, but not broken. The U.S. Army's ability to absorb the initial shock, stabilize key positions, and prevent the Germans from achieving decisive objectives in the first 48 hours became the foundation upon which the counteroffensive would later build. The German timetable, already fragile, had begun to collapse under the weight of American resistance, logistical problems, and deteriorating mobility. The battle was far from over, but the German attack was no longer unfolding as planned. As the German advance pushed deeper into the Ardennes, the operational picture grew increasingly complex. The initial shock had created a widening bulge in the American front, but the Germans had failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Their armored spearheads, though formidable, were now stretching supply lines to the limit. Fuel shortages, not Allied armies, became the most immediate enemy of the German offensive. Every mile gained consumed precious reserves, and destroyed American depots yielded far less fuel than expected. The advancing columns, designed for rapid exploitation, were now forced to halt repeatedly while officers searched for abandoned Allied supplies or siphoned fuel from disabled vehicles. This erosion of momentum gave American commands vital breathing room. In the midst of this expanding bulge, the town of St. Vith emerged as a major obstacle to German plans. Although partially enclosed, American units composed of elements from multiple divisions held the area far longer than the German timetable allowed. Their stubborn defense disrupted the coordination between advancing German corps, forcing armored divisions to maneuver on narrow roads already congested with supply vehicles. The delay at St. Vith had ripple effects across the entire offensive. German forces that expected to be miles beyond the town were still bogged down in the surrounding hills. Trading time they could not afford. Meanwhile, American artillery, though scattered, continued to deliver precise and concentrated fire on German approaches. Further west, the small crossroads town of Bastogne became the focal point of one of the most iconic stands of the entire campaign. Bastogne was not important because of size, but because it sat at the intersection of nearly all major roads in the central Ardennes. Without it, German armored units could not maneuver freely or resupply effectively. Recognizing its importance, American airborne units moved in to secure the town just as the German encirclement tightened. Although they arrived with limited winter clothing, scarce ammunition, and incomplete heavy weaponry, these units established a defensive perimeter and repelled repeated attacks. The encirclement of Bastogne was meant to collapse quickly, freeing German armor for exploitation. Instead, it became a fixed point that absorbed German strength and attention. The weather continued to play a decisive role during this phase. The persistent fog and low clouds grounded Allied aircraft, preventing reconnaissance and airstrikes. German units exploited this cover to advance, resupply, and reorganize. However, the same weather that shielded them also hid the true scale of American reinforcements pouring into the theater. Convoys of US divisions infantry, armored and airborne, moved steadily toward the Bulge. Engineers cleared roads. Military police directed columns through traffic nodes. Logistics units pressed forward with fuel, ammunition, and winter gear. The U.S. Army's vast transport network, supported by an industrial base capable of rapid replenishment, allowed reinforcements to reach critical sectors far sooner than German planners expected. As these reinforcements arrived, American commanders began shaping a more coherent defense. They aimed to hold the northern and southern shoulders of the Bulge, preventing the German offensive from widening further. On the northern shoulder, the defense at Elsenborn Ridge not only held but inflicted severe losses on German armored units attempting to break through. The terrain favored the defenders. Narrow approaches, clear fields of fire, and well-coordinated artillery turned each German attack into a costly effort. This sector became one of the most stable points in the American line, effectively blocking the northern path to the Meuse River. In the south, American units gradually consolidated to protect key road networks leading into Luxembourg and France. The improvised defensive positions began transitioning into structured lines. Backed by artillery and supported by mobile reserves, commanders recognized that absorbing the German attack was only the first phase. The second phase counterattack required holding enough ground to serve as a launching point. As more divisions arrived, the U.S. Army shifted from crisis management to deliberate operational planning. By the fourth and fifth days of the offensive, German forces were no longer advancing according to plan. Their armored spearheads were increasingly isolated, lacking the infantry support needed to secure flanks or clear bypassed American positions. Fuel shortages forced unexpected halts, tanks were abandoned on the roadside, and supply officers struggled to meet demands. The rigid structure of the German plan left little room for improvisation. Once the timeline collapsed, the offensive's logic collapsed with it. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army's logistical superiority began to manifest fully. Unlike the Germans, who depended on narrow forest roads vulnerable to congestion. The Americans possessed a deeper and more flexible network of highways and supply routes. Reinforcements arrived with standardized equipment, abundant ammunition, and predictable resupply schedules. Artillery batteries shifted positions, regrouping for coordinated fire missions. Communications gradually stabilized, enabling corps and army-level headquarters to reassert control. One of the most decisive developments during this period was the gradual clearing of the weather. As clouds lifted and fog dissipated, Allied aircraft returned to the battlefield. Fighter bombers struck German supply columns, strafed traffic jams, and attacked stalled armored units. Reconnaissance aircraft provided precise intelligence on German movements, allowing artillery to adjust fire with accuracy. The Luftwaffe, already weakened, could not contest Allied air superiority. The return of Allied air power severely restricted German mobility and eliminated any remaining hope of regaining momentum. By late December, it was clear that the German offensive had peaked. The initial surprise had yielded tactical gains, but not the strategic breakthrough required to alter the war's outcome. American units across the Bulge were regrouping, counterattacking locally, and tightening defensive lines. The German high command faced a battlefield that no longer matched its operational expectations. Fuel reserves were nearly exhausted, armored strength was eroding, and the weather, once an ally, now favored the United States. The stage was set for the next phase of the battle, the American counteroffensive that would compress the Bulge, relieve Bastogne, and reclaim lost ground. By late December, the German offensive had lost much of its momentum, but the situation on the ground remained fluid and intense. The U.S. Army, now reinforced and operating with clearer situational awareness, prepared to shift from defensive stabilization to coordinated counterattack. The transition required careful timing. Commanders needed to ensure that German spearheads were sufficiently weakened, that flanks were secure, and that supply lines could support sustained offensive action. The American command structure, from corps headquarters to division staff, gradually synchronized their plans with the weather's improving conditions and the growing presence of Allied aircraft overhead. One of the most pressing tasks was the relief of Bastogne, where American airborne units had been surrounded for days. Despite limited supplies and harsh winter conditions, defenders maintained control of the crucial road network and denied the Germans the freedom of movement they desperately needed. The siege tied down multiple German divisions that otherwise would have reinforced the central thrust. Recognizing Bastogne's importance, American commanders assigned the relief mission to Third Army. General Patton's forces executed one of the most rapid and complex operational maneuvers of the entire European campaign. Pivoting north through difficult terrain, Third Army advanced under constant pressure, opening corridors despite entrenched German resistance. As Third Army approached Bastogne, fighting intensified along the routes leading into the town. German units attempted to impede the relief force with roadblocks, anti-tank defenses, and well-positioned artillery. However, American combined arms tactics integrating tanks, infantry, engineers, and artillery out the advance to maintain steady momentum. On 26 December, elements of the lead armored division broke through to the outskirts of Bastogne, establishing physical contact with the defenders. This relief did not end combat in the area, but it restored a secure supply line that transformed Bastogne from an isolated strongpoint into a vital American foothold inside the German Bulge. With Bastogne relieved and German momentum fading, American forces prepared to compress the Bulge from the north and south. This required coordinated attacks across a broad front, often in conditions complicated by snow, ice, and limited visibility. In the northern sector, American infantry divisions, supported by artillery concentrated at Elsenborn Ridge, began pushing eastward. Their goal was to force German units back from captured territory and re-establish the original defensive line. The terrain remained challenging, with dense forests that restricted movement and provided opportunities for German rearguards to delay the advance. These rearguard actions were often fierce, involving ambushes, mines, and concealed anti-tank weapons. Nevertheless, the American numerical and logistical advantage gradually overcame these obstacles. In the central sector, the terrain around the towns of Foymar and Recon saw intense urban and semi-urban engagements. American units had two clear houses, barns, and outbuildings one by one, often under sniper fire or machine gun fire from concealed positions. Engineers played a critical role in breaching obstacles and clearing mines. Artillery, coordinated through forward observers, targeted German strongpoints and disrupted attempts at organized withdrawal. Although the Germans fought tenaciously, the lack of fuel for their armored vehicles severely limited their ability to counterattack. Tanks that could not be withdrawn were often destroyed by their crews to prevent capture. To the south, Third Army continued pressing forward, leveraging its relative mobility and operational flexibility. The improved weather allowed Allied air support to strike German positions ahead of advancing ground units. Fighter bombers targeted road junctions, bridges, and choke points, disrupting attempts to shift forces between sectors. German logistics, already strained by initial errors and Allied pressure, deteriorated further as vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. The shrinking bulge meant that German units were increasingly compressed into narrower corridors, making them more vulnerable to artillery and air attack. As American offensives from the north and south advanced, the bulge gradually narrowed. German positions that had been coordinated during the initial assault now found themselves isolated. Commanders faced difficult decisions: withdraw under pressure, hold positions at all costs, or attempt localized counterattacks with limited fuel and ammunition. In many cases, organized withdrawal became impossible due to American advances blocking key roads. German units often retreated through forest tracks or attempted night movements to avoid detection, but these efforts slowed their overall ability to escape encirclement. Weather continued to influence operations, but now in favor of the United States. Clearer skies allowed bombers to target German supply centers and troop concentrations behind the front. Reconnaissance flights identified movements that would have been invisible a week earlier. The Luftwaffe, already weakened by losses and fuel shortages, could not challenge Allied air superiority. As a result, the U.S. Army could coordinate its advances with near-constant aerial observation and support. During this phase, the U.S. Army's logistical strength became increasingly evident. Supplies moved in large volumes along restored road networks. Fuel trucks, ammunition, convoys, medical teams, and maintenance units followed closely behind the advancing front. Unlike the Germans whose supply system was collapsing, the Americans could replace losses, rotate units, and sustain pressure without interruption. Artillery remained one of the most decisive elements of the campaign. American fire direction centers used precise data from forward observers to deliver concentrated barrages that broke defensive lines, halted counterattacks, and softened strongpoints before infantry assaults. By early January 1945, the German High Command recognized that the offensive had failed. The Meuse River was no longer a realistic objective, and any hope of splitting the Allied lines had evaporated. The remaining goal was now to extract as many forces as possible before the encirclement tightened further. However, American counterattacks continued to gain ground, and German divisions found themselves increasingly isolated. Many units were reduced to fractions of their original strength. The harsh winter, logistical collapse, and constant pressure eroded morale and cohesion. As the bulge narrowed to its original front line, the U.S. Army regained control of key towns and road networks. The German offensive, once envisioned as a decisive blow, had become a costly failure. The United States had not only absorbed the attack, but reversed it through coordinated, large-scale operations. The stage was now set for the final reduction of the bulge and the restoration of the pre-offensive lines. By the second week of January 1945, American forces were fully committed to eliminating the remaining German presence inside the bulge. The strategic situation had shifted decisively. What began as a desperate German gamble had become a slow, grinding withdrawal under relentless U.S. pressure. American commanders aimed to restore the original front line while inflicting maximum attrition on German units that had expended their strength in the early days of the offensive. The counteroffensive was not a single unified push, but a series of coordinated attacks launched by multiple U.S. armies converging on the shrinking salient from opposite sides. In the northern sector, U.S. divisions continued pushing eastward from the stable anchor point at Elsenborn Ridge. This area, long held against the strongest German armored assaults, now served as a platform for steady American advances. Infantry battalions moved through forests and hills heavily scarred by weeks of fighting. German units, many reduced to small groups, attempted to slow the advance through ambushes, mines, and rearguard positions established in dense woodland. However, they lacked the artillery support, armored strength, and logistical capacity to halt the American movement. U.S. forces, supplied with ample ammunition, winter equipment, and replacements, steadily expanded their control. In the central corridor near Bastogne, the situation evolved into a series of local offensives designed to clear surrounding villages, road junctions, and high ground. Bastogne itself, now firmly held and supplied, acted as the pivot around which American operations rotated. The town's defensive perimeter had stabilized, but the surrounding countryside contained numerous German positions that had to be cleared. Urban and semi-urban fighting characterized this phase, with American infantry advancing house by house through snow-covered settlements. Engineers continued to play an essential role, breaching obstacles, clearing mines, and repairing or destroying bridges depending on operational needs. To the south, Third Army maintained its momentum, advancing through Luxembourg and northeastern France into the southern flank of the Bulge. The combination of mobility, firepower, and close air support allowed the army to push German defenders off successive ridgelines and defensive belts. Third Army's progress further constrained German maneuverability, compressing their units into a narrowing area where movement became increasingly difficult. The Germans attempted several counterattacks to slow the advance, but these efforts were hampered by lack of fuel, limited artillery, ammunition, and continuous airstrikes that disrupted assembly areas. As American forces pressed forward, the effects of Allied air superiority became even more pronounced. With the weather mostly clear, fighter bombers patrolled roads, destroyed columns attempting to withdraw, and targeted defensive positions ahead of us infantry. Reconnaissance aircraft identified weak points, allowing American artillery to pre-target German concentrations before ground assaults began. The German supply system, already in collapse, could not compensate for these losses. Vehicles were destroyed faster than they could be replaced, and fuel dumps were repeatedly struck from the air. The Luftwaffe remained almost absent, unable to intervene meaningfully. During this stage, American artillery continued to serve as the backbone of the advance. The U.S. Army's ability to mass fire from multiple battalions on short notice provided a decisive advantage. Fire missions were coordinated through integrated communication networks connecting forward observers, battalion fire direction centers, and chorus-level artillery commands. Accurate, sustained artillery fire disrupted German movements, shattered defensive strongpoints, and prevented effective counterattacks. The vast U.S. logistical system kept these guns supplied even in severe winter conditions, ensuring that artillery remained consistent throughout the counteroffensive. German commanders, recognizing that the offensive could no longer achieve any operational or strategic objectives, attempted to extract their remaining forces. However, the narrowing corridor, combined with American pressure from both north and south, made organized withdrawal increasingly impossible. Units that attempted to retreat during daylight risked destruction from the air. Those that moved at night struggled through snow-covered roads filled with abandoned vehicles. The initial German plan had relied on rapid forward movement. Once forced into retreat, the offensive's logistical structure proved incapable of supporting sustained defensive operations. As American units continued to converge, coordination between the attacking forces became more critical. Corps and army commanders synchronized movements to avoid gaps, while ensuring that pressure remained constant across the salient. Communications improved as lines were restored, and the situation stabilized. The U.S. Army's decentralized leadership, which had been crucial in the early days of the battle, now allowed operational flexibility. Divisions adjusted their axes of advance based on terrain, weather, and enemy resistance, maintaining a fluid but directed counter. By mid-January, German resistance stiffened in certain sectors as units attempted to establish temporary defensive lines to slow the American advance. These efforts, though often determined, lacked the depth and resources necessary for long-term holding actions. American forces methodically broke through these positions, using combined arms tactics to secure villages, crossroads, and high ground. The shrinking front forced German units into more compressed formations, making them vulnerable to artillery and airstrikes. Ammunition shortages became severe, and units increasingly relied on captured American equipment or improvised solutions. As the Bulge contracted further, American forces recaptured territory lost during the first days of the offensive. Road networks were reopened, towns liberated, and damaged infrastructure repaired or bypassed. Civilian populations, displaced or endangered by the fighting, began returning to devastated villages. The severity of the winter remained a challenge, with frostbite and exposure causing casualties on both sides. However, the U.S. Army's supply system delivered winter clothing, medical supplies, and food in quantities unmatched by the Germans, allowing American units to maintain operational capability. By the time American forces approached the original front line across multiple sectors, the German offensive had effectively collapsed. What remained was a broad withdrawal under constant pressure. The final reduction of the Bulge would require further advances, but the strategic threat posed by the German attack had been neutralized. The United States had not only halted the largest German offensive of the Western War, but had regained the initiative, setting the stage for the final push into the heart of Germany. By late January 1945, the German salient in the Ardennes had been reduced to a fragment of its initial size. The U.S. Army's coordinated counteroffensives from the north, south, and center steadily erased the gains the Germans had made in the opening days of the offensive. What had begun as a bold, high-risk gamble by Hitler had devolved into a costly defensive struggle for the German army. American forces, continuously supplied and reinforced, pressed forward with increasing confidence. The final phase of the battle became a deliberate effort to restore the pre-offensive line and eliminate German units still operating within the Bulge. The Germans attempted to organize a structured retreat toward the Siegfried Line, but the depth of their losses made such coordination nearly impossible. Many armored divisions had lost the majority of their operational vehicles. Infantry divisions were severely under strength, with companies reduced to handfuls of men. Artillery units lacked ammunition, and supply formations were overwhelmed by the logistical chaos. The German High Command issued orders for phased withdrawals, but the reality on the ground was a patchwork of disconnected movements performed under constant American pressure. Retreating units faced blocked roads, destroyed bridges, and American patrols cutting off escape routes. American forces advanced with a combination of caution and determination. While the German offensive had been broken, the terrain remained challenging. Snow and ice hindered movement, and German rearguard units still mounted ambushes or held temporary strongpoints to delay the pursuit. These positions often required coordinated infantry, armor, and artillery actions to clear. U.S. divisions conducted methodical attacks, using reconnaissance to probe defenses and artillery to soften resistance before advancing. Engineers continued to clear mines, repair bridges, and create alternate routes for supply convoys. In the northern sector, American units moved toward the towns of Butkenbach and Bullingenarius, close to the original front line and essential for re-establishing connections between corps. These towns had been heavily fought over during the German advance and were now scenes of destruction and disorganization. Clearing operations required patience and precision. German resistance, though weakened, remained determined in certain pockets, particularly in forested areas where terrain favored defense. American forces continued to exploit their advantages: superior artillery coordination, effective use of air support when weather allowed, and consistent resupply of ammunition and winter gear. The Central Sector's advance focused on regaining control of the key road network around Bastogne. Though the town itself was secure, the surrounding landscape remained contested. American units moved along ridgelines and through valleys, clearing German forces from villages such as Cabru-Champs and Longchamps. These areas had strategic importance because they controlled the approaches to Bastogne and allowed movement toward the original front. As U.S. forces advanced, they encountered evidence of the earlier fighting: destroyed tanks, burnt-out trucks, collapsed houses, and abandoned German equipment scattered across fields and forests. The scale of the destruction underscored the intensity of the earlier battles. To the south, Third Army continued, pushing eastward, compressing remaining German forces against the narrowing corridor leading toward the Siegfried Line. The combination of armored thrusts and infantry assaults forced German units into rapid withdrawals. Third Army's advances regained control of important towns and crossing points, reopening supply lines and enabling further pressure against German defenses. German counterattacks, though attempted, lacked coordination and often resulted in heavy losses. American forces used their mobility and firepower to maintain momentum and prevent German regrouping. As January drew to a close, the narrowing gap between the northern and southern American forces signaled the imminent end of the battle. The Bulge had been compressed to a small strip of territory, and remaining German units were either retreating hastily or preparing to surrender. When the two American pincers finally linked up, the front line was effectively restored. The German offensive was over. The U.S. Army had contained, resisted, and reversed the most ambitious attack Germany launched in the West after 1940. The Battle of the Bulge left significant consequences for both sides. For Germany, the offensive expended irreplaceable resources, vehicles, fuel, and trained manpower that could no longer be replenished. The Luftwaffe suffered further losses, and the German army's armored forces were permanently weakened. The attack, intended to force political negotiations, instead accelerated Germany's collapse. Strategically, the failed offensive destroyed any remaining capacity for large-scale operations in the West. From this point forward, German forces would remain on the defensive, unable to challenge the growing strength of the Allied armies converging on the Reich. For the United States, the battle demonstrated the resilience, adaptability, and logistical strength of the U.S. Army. Units initially overwhelmed by surprise, reorganized, stabilized, and held critical positions under extraordinary pressure. The defense of Elsenborn Ridge, the stand at Bastogne, and the rapid maneuver of Third Army showcased the ability of American forces to respond under crisis. Decentralized leadership, effective use of artillery, and the capacity to move reinforcements rapidly were decisive advantages. The U.S. logistical system, fuel convoys, ammunition supply, repair teams, and transportation networks played a vital role in sustaining both defensive and offensive operations during winter, conditions that tested every soldier involved. The restoration of the front line marked not only the end of the German offensive, but also the beginning of the final Allied push into Germany. In the months that followed, American forces crossed the Rhine, encircled major German formations, and advanced deep into the interior of the Reich. The Battle of the Bulge, far from weakening the United States, had strengthened the resolve and confidence of its commanders and soldiers. It proved that even under surprise, severe weather, and intense pressure, the U.S. Army could absorb a major blow and return it with overwhelming force. By early 1945, the strategic initiative rested firmly with the United States and its allies. The last German gamble had failed, and the path to final victory in Europe was now open.